Hey, thanks for joining us here at Shape the System. It's a podcast dedicated to sharing the stories of people who've helped shape the system for the better. We hope to tell these stories in the hope that will inspire more people to rethink the way the world works. Welcome, Mark. It's great to have you on the Shape the System podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So I just wanted to start by just tell us a little bit about what you're doing with Impact Africa and a little bit about you. Just get us in the zone.
Yeah, so I'll start with what we do. So Impact Africa is a startup studio in Nairobi. Basically, we are building a very early stage infrastructure for enabling young innovators to access the startup opportunity, or what I like to call the digital transformation of Africa opportunity. We have a lot of young talent. Africa is probably the youngest continent on the planet right now, median age of 19 and a half, sub-Saharan Africa has. And so at the same time, there's this other, on the flip side of that, there's a massive opportunity to build into, because for the longest time, Africa has not been a market for tech companies, generally speaking. And so now everybody's looking to that as a massive growth opportunity to create, not just build products, but also to build an economy around that and to leverage the young talent to solve problems fundamentally, right? So the issue is, while this is true, you have talent on one side, young talent, and then you have massive market opportunity to actually build into and solve problems. There is not a path to pipeline that young talent into that process, because we don't have the infrastructure as you might have.
Right.
So, for example, the famous region being Silicon Valley, and I'm sure in Sydney you also have an entrepreneurship ecosystem that enables people to actually be able to step forward into that process. So that's what we do, essentially. We're stitching up that very early stage.
Okay. There's two things you there that I really want to touch on. You talked about talent and you talked about infrastructure. Let's unpack those a little bit more. So when you talk talent, are you talking bright young minds? Are you talking people who've come out of technical colleges who can code or design or growth hack or market research? Or give me some definition around talent. And then when you talk about infrastructure, let me understand that a bit more as well.
Yeah, so just basically the way you described it, right? We have about 18 public universities in Kenya and a raft of private institutions. And at the same time, vocational kind of institutions that are built around digitization and technology and coding and design and so on and so forth. So there is a growing abundance of that type of talent, but there is not a well-defined path to taking it and pipelining it into creation of ideas, of manifesting ideas into reality, or at least getting a chance to pursue the ideas that they might have, right? Because over here you have, from an infrastructure standpoint, at the end of the day, you have to be able to take that leap or take that risk. And we're a very risk-averse society, like sub-Saharan Africa. If you think about where we are economically, you have to have a certain amount of wealth, if you will, for people to be able to say, even if it's at a family level, but even at a society level, where you have the safety nets and the feeling that, I can bounce back from any setbacks that I might have, or failure, if you will. And we don't have those luxuries here, right? People are pipelined, get a good education, get a good job, and a safe, secure job at a big company. That's what success is about. But the world is changing so fast, even some of those big companies are struggling to even keep up, right? And so when young people are kind of being, the internet has opened up their eyes to the rest of the world, and everybody hears the stories of entrepreneurship and success and what's possible, and it's all over the place right now. So there's also that information flow that's happening, and young people just don't want to play the game that they've seen the other generations play. And at the same time, there's a significant unemployment rate. So it's all these dynamics that are playing into this desire for them to actually take control of their own destiny. But it's still they don't have a path to it, right? They're kind of still stymied and stifled. And so they're kind of being pushed in the direction of what has been already defined, but very reluctantly. And a lot of them are kind of like, you know what, I'm going to try something, but it's still not yet at, maybe that's, I would say, a very small minority can actually afford to do that. And some of them do it out of just necessity, which is very different than doing it out of like passion for a problem you want to solve. If I'm doing it to survive, it's not the same. I'm not going to have my whole kind of sequencing of every decision I make is very different, right? I'll make short-term decisions versus long-term strategic ones. And that creates a mess in terms of opportunities that might have been great, end up failing prematurely and unnecessarily, just because it's just a very high pressure situation. As you can imagine, right, as an entrepreneur, you have all these other kind of issues that you have to deal with and family expectations, and society doesn't really. The other thing too is we are very much driven by a title society. So if you have a title at a company, you're much more respected. While at the same time, we're talking about how entrepreneurship is this cool thing, but we haven't elevated it to a level where we respect people who take that risk. We see them almost as, we're not sure what to do with them. So anyway, so all those problems create the conditions
right.
that
You're solving all those problems. I mean, so I want to break that down maybe a little more at a practical level for people. So Impact Africa, you described it as a startup studio, and it's obviously working on two sides, being the talent and there's, providing some form of infrastructure. What's the experience that happens for someone being on the talent side, the young African who comes into the studio? Talk me through what their experience is, what they're doing and what they're achieving and what they're going out into the world with as a result.
Fundamentally, it's about eliminating all those roadblocks that I described, mentally and structurally. So you come into the studio and right away you have a stipend. Basically, it's an internship, right? So you're there for a year and you're actually doing what society expects you to do, get an internship after college, right? So you've checked that box. So in your mind, you're not like, am I doing the right thing? You're like, yeah, I'm doing the right thing. It's just in a different direction and a different environment. And so we put together teams of young folks to pursue well-vetted ideas, because what I believe is in Africa, there's market opportunities that are real ones, that are not discovery, that are not kind of like, oh, let me try this social thing and see if it will actually take off. No, build HR software for the HR market, build products into, for example, fundraising tools or the banking industry. There's so much. So fundamentally, it's about saying, okay, where should we spend our time trying to build into a real business? So the process is 12-month internships, groups of 3 or 4 working on a project. We call them projects. And the idea is it's sequenced over 12 months, the product development or project roadmap, if you will. The first 6 months is actually developing an MVP, right? So a team of 3 will work on actually getting from 0 to 1, if you will, at least from a traction standpoint. And the goal is to actually have POCs in place.
Sure.
Maybe a handful of customers, right? If it's a B2B situation, if it's a B2C situation, you actually have users and growth. And that's when we make a decision if we'll actually continue on that project or we'll sunset it and work on something else. And then the second 12 months is really now, okay, let's move in more of a kind of predictable growth cadence, if you will. Do we have a business model? Do we have a go-to-market strategy? Are we doing the things that we need to do?
Right. So when you talk about the infrastructure, you're talking about giving people who perhaps haven't had access to, I'm going to use the word playbook, that might not be the best word, but a playbook that says if you want to bring these businesses, these ventures to market that solve core problems that exist within any society that have actually been solved in their own guise in other markets. So we're not trying to completely reinvent the wheel, but we're saying if you're going to launch, I think one of the examples we've spoken about before is car sharing. If we're going to launch car sharing in Africa, well, our version of car sharing needs to solve the problems that will be encountered when you try to launch that concept here. So the concept exists, if you like, and you've seen those concepts working well elsewhere. But if we're going to bring it into the African market or the sub-Saharan market, then why not? It should be us bringing it in and understanding how to solve it in the local context rather than having someone else bring it in on our behalf. And how do you sort of marry those two things together? Am I understanding that right?
Precisely. Yeah, you're understanding it totally correctly. So some things will be duplicatable and localizable.
Right.
Some things will also be leapfrogs, because at the same time, we don't have a lot of the things that the West might have in terms of pre-built infrastructure and ecosystems around specific domains or industry. So in some cases, we will also just create things that are local, that will solve local problems that may not exist in the West. So it's both sides work, but yeah.
Yep, totally understand it. And then there's something interesting about the way this system works. We'll get onto your background in a little bit, and we always start with what you're doing, and then we get back to the story a bit later on. But part of this is you and the work that you're doing with the talent and to create the kind of environment for them to be able to learn and start solving the problems and ideally building ventures. But to make this happen, you've also got founders on the other side who may not have been in Africa, who've come out of other businesses, typically either had some success. Tell me how the larger ecosystem outside of Africa is playing a role in what you're trying to do in Africa.
Yeah, so fundamentally, it's what are the two things that are lacking? The two things that are lacking in any ecosystem is experience and funding, if you will, right? So people who know what to do, so they can bridge the gap for us in terms of moving from 0 to 1, and also funding. So initially, we're set up as a nonprofit entity. And if you look at where successful entrepreneurs generally congregate are in the West from a technology startup standpoint, that's where Silicon Valley and around the world. And a lot of them have give back interests along both lines. One being, hey, I would like to actually make a dent in the universe outside a capitalistic environment, so they have philanthropic interests. So they support us from that perspective. And we're set up in that way because we need to be able to, first of all, we can't run before we walk. So if we try a venture model right now, we're not yet at the point where I'm comfortable opening it up to that, because it has certain expectations of how you move through a process, how you make decisions and all that stuff. We need to, first of all, really build process, culture, and be very good at what we do. Then we will pivot into a venture model. So initially, we are set up as a nonprofit entity, registered in the US and in Kenya. Right. And that allows us a space to actually build out our processes in a much more kind of patient way, in a much more careful way, if you will, right? So that's how they participate.
Yeah, and the founders themselves. So I'm just making sure I understand this. There's a part of this which is to go and find 100 founders who've had success in ventures themselves, probably as an entrepreneur or maybe as an early employee or at a thing, and appeal to their ideal of, I want to be in some way involved in influencing or changing or shaping a system beyond the one that I just worked at and potentially exited and made a reasonable amount of money out of. So just I want to understand that connection a bit better.
Yeah, so fundamentally, it's when entrepreneurs who have succeeded look back, they always can point to somebody believed in me, somebody helped me out, somebody created an infrastructure that I was able to take advantage of, whether it was just support that they were able to provide. And so I was able to ride on the coattails of other folks. We are starting from a very low bar, and entrepreneurs understand the power of ecosystem and that support infrastructure. If it doesn't exist, they wouldn't be where they are for the most part, right? And so they're like, okay, yeah, I get what you're doing. So I'm excited to be part of creating that infrastructure, and that's what we are doing. So they provide the funding for us, because we're basically building out the ecosystem, if you will, that will provide, again, it's that. So they get that. And then the other thing too is expertise, right? Experience, right? So for a couple of ways that we do that. One is at scale, where we host people who've actually been there, done that, to do what I call ecosystem talks. We call them the Past Speaker Series. We host people in the market to come and share their expertise. Makes a big difference when you can actually see, touch, feel, whatever. Somebody is actually worth $1 billion, right? Or whatever. And they share their experience. And you can see it's not that different from yours. So you're like, wow, I can actually do this. And they also provide some technical insights. Where we will take it beyond that is actually providing more. The world right now, you can provide mentorship from Australia, if you will. Like you and I have talked back and forth on some of the things that we're working on, gotten feedback from you on some of our fundraising messaging and so on and so forth. And I've even talked to folks like, for example, Scott Harrison, who's the founder of Charity Water. He's made himself available to provide some feedback in terms of our messaging. So that type of thing will happen. Out of these 100 founders, there'll be people who'll be like, yeah, I can jump on a call, I can mentor a team, I can provide insight. If we're going into a specific domain where somebody has specific experience, we can tap them. And they can really narrow the gap for us in terms of, okay, this is what you need, this is the infrastructure you need to build from a technology standpoint. These are the gotchas you need to watch out for, and that type of thing. So it's both expertise and that funding,
Yeah. I mean, it's a potent mix, right? I mean, most founders who've gone through and created something in whatever context, could be profit, non-profit, sustainable, are typically bound by capital, but then also the capital represents the number of mistakes you're able to make. So if you find a way to make less mistakes, or if you like, or limit the impact of those mistakes, that can be beneficial. Just coming back a little bit from Impact Africa for a second, your background is fascinating. So I'd love to sort of take a step through that a little bit. You spent, I think, about 15 years in the Valley from memory. But if we can wind it back even before that, talk me through you growing up and how you got to a point where you jumped on a plane and went to the Valley and then came, just give us that arc of a story.
Yeah, so born and raised in Nairobi, went to high school here and all that. And very early on, I was raised by a single mom, and that had its challenges financially. And I kind of very early on made the decision that I would eliminate the financial challenge from my life. Not necessarily money motivated or driven by that. I don't dream about money, but I just don't want to think about it anymore. So just seeing what the struggles that my mom went through just to keep a roof over her head and kind of keep things on an even keel, I very early on made a decision that, I need to solve this in my life. very early and quickly and efficiently, if you will. Right? And so when I looked at the inventory of assets, if you will, or capabilities, I played soccer and I was decent and I was good at the game. Played at my school, high school, and I realized that this was the path. And I loved the sport. That was my passion. When I was younger, and I made the decision that this has to play a role in bridging the gap for me to the next stage. Right. And so initially it was I wanted to go pro and play in the UK and try to go down that path and wasn't able to just because of visa restrictions. And the next best thing to me was, okay, I need to figure out how to make this work. So I got a sports scholarship to the US and played soccer at university over there. And this was I'm kind of abbreviating, but it was a total commitment and a passion. And so was able to do that, got a full ride scholarship at a university in West Virginia. And went through that process, studied econ and minored in information systems. At the time, I was just thinking, okay, what is the shortest path between me and a certain level of income? And again, you only do what you've been exposed to. So at the time, I was studying econ and hedging my bets with this information systems minor. And so I was thinking, okay, it's technology or business. Somehow, I've got to get to a VP level. That's all I knew, right? You got to get to a VP level, make $300,000 a year, and out of that, I can live off $100,000. I can send $100,000 home to my family to start businesses, and then I can put $100,000 in for my retirement. No clue about taxes or even. So I was like, what's the shortest? Yeah, clearly. No clue, right? So what's the shortest distance between where I am right now in university and that? And I remember even talking to, at the time I worked a part-time job in the school IT department, and the smartest person I knew at the time was our systems administrator on campus, because he was the most knowledgeable technology mind I knew. And so I went and asked him, like, I want to become a leader in business, in an enterprise, in a company. What's the most efficient path there and most sure path there? Is it through business or technology? Such a broad question, right? Like, this is all I know. His answer was technology. And I was like, okay, cool. I'll focus on that, right? But anyway, long story short, I was fortunate that my aunt lived in the Bay Area. So I used to take my summer breaks to go and visit over there. And that's when I was exposed to that world. The first startup I actually ever worked for was the original Uber that nobody ever heard of. So it was a summer job in 1999. And
the original Uber, what was the name of this company?
Yeah, ridesource.com. Perfect. It was the .com era. Ridesource.com.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And so
that was the actual name of the company, had a .com. Yes, I love it.
Yeah. So anyway, so I was exposed to this world where people were trying to solve problems that you knew existed, and I was so fascinated by that. And fortunately for me, I had family there, so I could kind of get started. And that's kind of how I got plugged into the Bay Area. First job after school was at a traditional semiconductor enterprise company, National Semiconductor. They don't exist anymore. They were bought by, I think, Texas Instruments. But anyway, the Valley initially was built on the semiconductor companies, right? That was kind of the legacy of Silicon Valley. So I worked at that company, and the first day I walked into that company, I was like, wow, this is so different. I was crestfallen because the interview process was so cool. I thought this was going to be a very different experience. But when I walked into the work area, it was cubicleville, as far as the eyes could see. And I was like, oof, this is going to be hard. I only lasted 8 months, and I realized that, okay, I'm a small business person. I'm not good. This enterprise thing won't work for me. So that's when I went down, and that was after the .com crash. And so I went somebody recruited me into the mortgage industry for a couple of years, and it was just, it was like a party where everybody was invited and playing. And it wasn't. At some point, I was just like, man, I'm doing these things that are very basic, right? I'm selling money that is very basic from a mortgage refinance standpoint. It was so hot at the time in the Valley. And I was like, okay, I need to get out of this before the crap hits the fan. My econ background was telling me there's too much supply here. So at some point, this is going to fall over. And this was in 2004. And at the same time, I was missing that stimulation of technology and complexity and that stuff. So I opted out in 2004 because I was really afraid that everybody's in this game right now. And when it falls over, everybody will be looking for tech jobs. And I need to be ahead of that. So I kind of left and went back into the startup world. Yeah.
Yeah. What were the roles that you were doing? Like, tech is a broad word, right? You can be doing enterprise sales. You can be doing a sysadmin role. Like, you can be coding or doing product development. And I think this is important because you've obviously had enough exposure to how tech, and especially early stage tech, works to think, we need to be doing more of this back where I grew up. So what were the roles that you were actually doing in these companies, or maybe in the most recent one before you came back to Nairobi?
So enterprise sales, and I started from the bottom, right? I started from being what they call a sales development rep,
Yeah.
and and then worked my way up into corporate rep and all these other levels to the enterprise side. And for me, that's always been kind of where I've played. But I've always had this broader view of the business and the market, which is great. I think some of the best salespeople in technology are some of the most capable folks because they can actually see from product development and the dysfunctions that you have in a company in terms of of pushing new features to the pressure from customers to actually create those features and how efficient are we as a company to respond. So they're right at the tip of the spear. They kind of sit at this place where it is they can see everything, right? If they are so inclined to think at the systems level, right? The competition in the market, the challenges in the company, everything that you're almost like you develop this framework for thinking about technology, business, markets, go to market, internal operations, because you know that if your marketing is not getting the message right in an efficient way, and if they're being out messaged by your competition, your host, right? So there's so much that you develop in the understanding of how a technology product should move into a market, right? And the structures that you need to support that process. It's a phenomenal experience, right? So that was what I did.
Yeah, and then at some point in understanding that, so look, I don't disagree. I worked in enterprise sales for a while, and you have to be you're at the coalface in terms of dealing with the customer, but then also you're having to understand how the sausage gets made. At some point, you've woken up and gone, I'm not actually, other than selling a lot of stuff and maybe sending money back to Africa and putting some in your IRA, I'm not actually making enough of an impact here. What was the moment that sort of triggered this idea that I have to regroup here and I have to go and do something different? And then what led you from there back to, I'm going to go and do Impact Africa?
Yeah, good question. So it was an evolution, right? So initially you're just so excited to be in the valley, but after some time you started to see the cycles repeat themselves. And the other piece of that is you're looking for opportunities where it's hot, what I would call the it companies or the it industry. So in the 2000s, it was, cloud and Salesforce was leading the charge down that path, and trying to get opportunities at those types of companies and not being able to get in while some of your colleagues that you worked with. So I worked at Oracle for a while. That was the one big company I worked at. And you see people who you worked with getting into those companies, and then you're like, okay, that's interesting. And just realizing that everybody kind of looks the same and you're kind of very much an outsider. Just being from Africa, and many times I was the only African person at a company, right? Many times that was just kind of like my life. And at first you kind of just adjust, and you're like, yeah, this is reality, this is great. I can compete with anybody. But at some time you start to get tired because you need people who understand you. You need people who you can have a joke with, who you can kind of just be comfortable around it and that type of stuff. So you start getting exhausted playing this game where you're always adjusting to the conditions, just at a human level, right? And so that's a problem. And then you're not getting the right opportunity. Sure. So Salesforce was it was 2010. I tried to get, I think late 2010, 2011, I tried to get into Salesforce. Wasn't able to. Didn't even get past the first on-site interview. And I was like, okay, that can happen, 2013, 2014, actually, it was Amazon Web Services when they opened an office in San Francisco, and a bunch of the people I worked with at Oracle were airlifted over there as things happened. And I went for an interview and went through a process, and I thought I did great. And the last interview was a video conference with somebody who showed up late, it was the end of the day. She just wasn't in the mood. And that was just and I was just like, man, after that, I was like, you're done. You're toast. You're not getting this opportunity. These are the it companies. This is where people wanted to be. And the last company was Slack, right? Same thing. Went through the process. Right. Even got to at every stage, I got further into the interview process. At Slack, I got to the point where I was being asked for references, and all of a sudden they went cold. Yeah, and you know what? At that time, I just looked back and was like, "There's a pattern here, right? The it companies, I'm not getting in, and I believe I'm really good. Like I take my craft seriously. One, yet I can agree, you're not gonna get me. Two, yeah. Three, come on. So by that time, to be honest, I'd been thinking about, man, is America where I want to spend the rest of my life? I'd been asking myself these questions, and the other bigger one too was like, I'm a mission-driven person. I'm always driven to unlock human potential. that to me is what makes me tick at the individual level and at the systemic level. So I've been asking myself this deeper existential question, right? Like, what's my TED talk, quote unquote, right? 10 years from now, right? 10 years from now, what is the thing that I'll be able to say I've been doing this for 10 years, right? I was looking for that thing. And so all these things were happening at the same time. And in 2017, I took a trip back home to Kenya. My ex-wife and I had made the decision very early on that our kids would spend a couple of years in Kenya going to school so they can have that acculturation, a different perspective in life. Just not America isn't everything, right? So America is very hard on young people, as a matter of fact. For kids to grow up in America is not easy. It's really, really hard, especially if they're especially if they're African American or Black.
Yeah.
And so we made that conscious decision. So we had come to look at schools, and through that I came across an experience where there was an entrepreneur who had proven a business model, but they were really struggling to scale it, and their growth path was, the marginal. It was getting individual investors to invest in a specific piece of the business. Basically, it was fish cage farming. So he was growing it, and he would come to you and say, "Hey, Vince, here's what we do. I can manage a fish cage for you, and you put money in, get money out, essentially." And his growth path was to talk to every one person at a time. Very, very painful, right? Growth experience. So think about raising money every single time you want to grow by the marginal cage. So I was like, Jesus Christ, this is ridiculous, right? And if we can't unlock people who have that much ingenuity and gumption and capability, we are not going to have economic development. So I started asking myself, how do you solve that problem? Because we're in the Valley, once you've proven something at some level, they'll chase you down the street with money. And so I started trying to ask myself, and at that time, I'd left my last startup just after that Slack interview.
Yeah.
That was also another experience where you're working at a company and you just have a different view. I'd been there for 3 years, done well, but you just have a different view on integrity, for that matter, right? Just calling a spade. Sometimes people will fudge here and there. And anyway, so it was just a point where I was like, I need to kind of really figure out the next part. Sometimes things happen in your life to force you down a path that you should be going down anyway, right? And it was an amicable parting of ways. They actually were very good about it. They actually provided a package for me to actually to part ways at the company. So this is where I was at the time. And that's when I was interviewing at Slack, because I was like, I love that product. I want to be part. I want for at least one time be part of a growth situation in the Valley, right? A real growth one, right? And so I thought that's what I would do. And then when that didn't happen, that's when I took time off, did some traveling a little bit, and that's when I came across this big gap in our market. And to me, I thought it was a funding gap, right? And I started researching who's funding, what are they funding, what's the problem. So I started doing this. Yeah, and I was still in the States. So I'd taken that trip here in June, July of 2017, was back in the States in August. And from August to December, I was in this research mode where I was interviewing entrepreneurs on this side. I actually made a trip back here in October. It was just this thing that totally sucked me in when I started unpacking it and understanding it. And it became increasingly clear that this is probably what you've been looking for, because you're uniquely positioned to solve this problem. Yeah, and so it was a series of events, and the idea was, let me set up our seed fund,
right?
To start funding, to make it possible for folks to actually get capital.
Right. And you realize at that point you're not even up to that, right? There's your observation of what happened in the Valley was you can't start with funding. You have to start with the infrastructure to support businesses to even exist that then need funding. You can't put the cart before the horse.
Yeah, but to be fair, there's people who've actually built businesses, right? They're entrepreneurs who are doing things, right? Quite a few of them, right? But the question becomes, what type of business are they? There's a very interesting nuance here. Africa is full of entrepreneurs, right? But entrepreneurs by necessity are very different than entrepreneurs by maybe, for want of a better term, is scale or enterprise level, or it's a different kind of cadence or directionality.
Entrepreneur by desire? Maybe?
Yeah, maybe by desire. Or what did you say? Desire or design?
Yeah, entrepreneur by desire, like someone who says, I want to solve this problem.
Yes. That's actually a great way to characterize it. I want to survive and make sure that I can put food on the table. Or, you know what, man? That's important too, but I have this other bigger kind of higher order thing, or self-actualization, you name it, make a dent in the universe. This problem needs to be solved, and I want to be part of solving. We don't have that yet, right? So when you are an entrepreneur by survival, if you will, you have only a certain goal you want to achieve, and that has not much to do with that doesn't work for venture funding scale, right? You get to a point where your goal, the way I define it is survival to lifestyle. Once you achieve lifestyle, in a lifestyle business, it doesn't have to have too much structure or strategy. You can be very happy.
Sounds like a great business.
Right. And so that's great. That's fine. But, that's, especially in technology, unfortunately, you can have a great consulting kind of, business with that, build bespoke products. And that's what our ecosystem was built on for the longest time. So people are not ready to absorb capital. Right. That's what I'm getting at. Right? They don't have the mindset to think that this is actually, they're very, very scared about that, number one, right? Because they haven't seen it before. What does it mean? Will I lose control? So they're not structured to actually absorb that, both from a mental standpoint and also from a company structure standpoint.
Do you think that coming into the the role of Impact Africa as in terms of shaping a system at the moment in Nairobi, but generally potentially beyond that as well, I'm expecting you're thinking sub-Saharan Africa generally, is to almost bring a system of thinking to a continent that says, here is how these businesses come out of the woodwork. This doesn't just magically happen. There's a set of conditions that make it possible for entrepreneurs to flourish, and capital follows that. And is that really at the fundamental kind of crux of what it is? Like, am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, you are. But let me say that there's people who've actually built scaled up companies here already, right? A handful of people have actually done that. And there are super smart people out here who have done amazing things in different industries. Right. It's just not common knowledge. Right? The people coming out of campus or university, that's just not a thing they've been exposed to. It's just not what happens. And so, yes, you can almost think about it as continuation of education, if you will, in the way the world needs to teach people and prepare people for the conditions that exist today, right? So it's almost like a quote-unquote MBA program, if you will, in a very practical business building sense, right? And so, yes, it is about getting people to absorb that mindset, right? So we have a huge mental transformational kind of exposure thing that happens intentionally, right? So our people listen to podcasts, our people are exposed to the startup world, our people are exposed to information that they would never have had a reason to actually even know or listen to, or unless they really accidentally came across it. So we're intentionally working towards transforming mindset and educating people. So for example, in our Slack channel, we use Slack. We have this thing called The Brain. And The Brain is where people actually listen to cool stuff that they learn and share, a link to a podcast, to a document, to a blog. And so I keep insisting, these are the 6-7 podcasts that you need to be listening to. That's how you learn. That's how this is the world now is you learn through. I think we have open university across across the globe right now. Information is freely available, right? And so that's one thing, right? Introducing that mindset, teaching people like, okay, these things, this is, and we know a lot of people have just been exposed to an established company. And so what does that look like when it's beginning? Nobody has had an opportunity to actually see that. And if you haven't seen that, it doesn't matter, right? Anybody can tell you their story, but if you haven't been part of the process of starting something and seeing how the uncertainty, the variability, the iterations you need to make, and you see the thing move forward, I'm sorry, you're just never going to appreciate it, right? And so exposing them to that sequence in the flesh is huge. So those two things working together, the exposure to information and knowledge and mindset and thinking, and actually practically being part of a process is how you transform people. Yeah.
And then if you elevate that to what you're trying to achieve, you talked a little bit about, further down, maybe having a fund or something. So that's sort of practical terms. But from an outcome, like what's the potential here? Like if you think about just the startup studio today that exists in Nairobi, and you fast forward 5 years, what are the headlines read like?
Yeah, in terms of defining the outcomes in terms of performance across the ecosystem, or
like is it like 10 I remember reading something on the site a while back about there's X number of companies creating Y amount of business value or something, or employment. What is that?
Right. So the way I think about it, fundamentally it has to come to what is, when the rubber meets the road, what are we talking about in terms of results, right? And so we have this thing called the Vision 2030, which is 10 companies that have achieved some level of scale, right, in our portfolio, that offer 10,000 jobs, right, that are valued at $10 billion, right, across our portfolio. And so we call it the 10-10-10 plan. And it's very much aligned with broader SDG goals and also the MasterCard Foundation. I just learned this very recently, also have a vision for 30 million jobs globally in the developing world. That's their goal. That's what they're working towards. And they provide funding for different kind of infrastructure or enablement programs, from skills training to intervention programs such as ours, and that type of stuff. So when I found that out, I was like, wow, yeah, 30 million, that's great. So I have a good basis to actually say that this is the direction we want to go, and it's achievable, right? There's so much potential sitting on the sidelines. There's so much opportunity. We just need to actually figure out how to create the process that will unlock that potential and drive it. And we're not sitting on the sidelines just talking about it. We are busy making it happen. And so that's the goal.
Yeah, totally get it. And look, probably just one last question from me. And I guess what I'm trying to do is most often when I see people who are changing a system or rethinking the way a system might work, they have their own inspirations and influences of things that, that they love, that they're like, oh, you got to check this person out, the guy or girl. They're working on the most amazing thing. Like, who is that for you? What is that problem? Like, where do you draw your own inspiration from?
I guess I always look at people who've actually transformed society or systems, right? The classics, right? Like Nelson Mandela. I mean, I was alive when this guy was in jail. And for me, like, I couldn't wrap my head around it. Like, this guy is in jail for 27 years. I couldn't, how? Like, I couldn't see myself doing that, right? And then MLK and that whole challenge of people putting their lives on the line to create change has always been so inspirational for me. And so right now, I guess those would be my people who for me, it's not about me. It's not about us. It's about making life better for those around us. I can't think of anything better to do than immerse yourself in the process of creating change for humanity, for people, right? I mean, and it's so interesting that every single generation has to learn this, or every single person has to learn that. When you found a company, it's no longer about you, right? When you employ people, for example, yourself, you're thinking about your employees and their well-being, right? At the end of the day, right? And so that changes you fundamentally. And if you can just embrace that process and be like, that's what life is about, then you'll be fine. And so for me, those are the things that inspire me. Those are the individuals who've put themselves on the line to actually bring that transformation to bear. Yeah, and there's a ton of them, right? There's examples of people who actually, when they start companies and they're about the mission and they're about the people, and there's a few of them in different companies that people have actually created the cultures. For example, I think Netflix has a great culture, right? The culture is very people-centric and it's talent-centric, but they're going after something. So for me, those are always the people who inspire me. People who create cultures that create cultures and systems, that allow people to thrive and unlock their potential. So yeah, I mean, there's a ton of examples across the business landscape. This gentleman he wrote the book Ray Dalio, for example, the culture he created at Bridgewater.
Oh yeah, Ray Dalio.
Yeah, there's amazing people who have integrated their passion and their skills into the enablement of humanity. And to me, that's the story. That's what we need to be doing.
Well, that's perfect. That's probably a good way to round out, given we're a podcast interviewing specifically people doing that kind of thing. That's awesome. All right, mate.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's been great.
Thanks for joining us here today. As always, if you know anyone who you think we should interview, please let us know. If you have any feedbacks on how to improve Shape the System, email us at feedback@shapethesystem.org.